have as a panel, and I hope Ryan will get in soon. Ryan and I did talk quite a lot yesterday about what we were going to do. We have a sort of structure for the hour, but most importantly, we will be happy to answer questions, and so any questions that come up at any time, please just break in and ask them, and it doesn't have to be on the exact subject that we're talking about. As Ken said, I am a faculty member at USC. I've been at USC since 1992, and it's kind of events like this that make you realize and think about how you've evolved personally in chemistry, and I'll say a little bit about that because I'm a very different sort of chemist, and I'll always be a chemist, but I'm a very different chemist, I think, now than I was even quite honestly 10 years ago, and certainly 28 years ago when I arrived at USC. And even before that, I went through some process as a PhD student and then a postdoc, and I was listening to the end, the last 15 minutes or so of the previous panel, and this point about self-confidence is so important, and I think it just applies to everybody. That I put such an effort in working with students, in working with PhD students, in working with postdocs, and even working with my faculty colleagues, just to bolster their confidence. It's very easy, I think, in science in general. We're very critical, and we should be, of course. We should be critical of each other's science. We want the science to be right. When you review a grant, you review a paper, whatever it may be, you should do it critically and carefully. And if there's something wrong, you need to point it out. But at the same time, as scientists, I think we don't pay enough attention, perhaps, to bolstering each other, to congratulating each other, if it comes down to it, on our successes, whether it be large or small. I think that's a crucial element. I frankly don't want science to become, quote, soft. I think we should be critical. We must have people who understand that and can take criticism, but at the same time, we don't want to put people off the field by being overtly negative. And I think, unfortunately, that does happen some of the time. So that's something we can talk about, and how you do that. And of course, that can start at a very early age. Ryan and I, we suggested that, and we decided that we start out with some personal stories of how we became scientists and ultimately academic scientists. And I think this is also something that perhaps chemists ought to share a little bit more. I've been on a few panels this week in various contexts, and I think there's almost a certain amount of embarrassment among scientists, again, perhaps because we are meant to be rational and hardcore, and emotions don't come into it, and so on and so forth. But I think a little bit of sharing of these kind of stories is interesting, and I will share my personal story, and this really is a true story. And I was 12 years old, and in the UK, that's the start of what was at the time known as grammar school. And it was so it was my first term in grammar school, and it's a big deal to go to grammar school. And we were doing chemistry, and so it was one of the very early chemistry classes I had, and the teacher had a pile of iron filings on the desk and a pile of sulfur, and he mixed them up, and it became a kind of yellowy black mess. And then next to this, he had another yellowy black mess that he told us was iron sulfide. So I had no idea what iron sulfide was, but it looked exactly the same. And he said, there's iron and sulfur here, there's iron and sulfur over here in this iron sulfide. And then he put a magnet to the mixture of iron and sulfur. And of course, the iron went to the magnet and the sulfur stayed where it was. In other words, they were separated. And he put a magnet to the iron sulfide. And of course, nothing happened, no separation. And then he said, that's a chemical bond. There's something holding that iron and sulfur together in the iron sulfide that isn't present in the mixture. And of course, you know, the 30 boys, because it was an all boys school in the class, 29 of them thought, you know, why can't I get out and play soccer? But what's this guy wasting my time with? I just sat there and I truly remember this moment and I was just transfixed and I thought, wow. And from that moment, honestly, I've studied chemistry, I've studied bonding, I've studied intermolecular interactions, and I still remember it. And I still remember it. I've never lost that excitement from that moment. And that really is a true story. And there's a little bit more to this story, because the man who did this, and sadly now has passed away, is a man called Frank Marsden, who's my teacher. And 30 years later, he, by a remarkable coincidence, moved into a house where opposite to where my parents lived. By this time I was in the US, but I go home to visit my parents, and I met him 30 years later, and I told him about this. And he, you know, this, I don't know that it made his life, but it was a phenomenal moment for him that he'd made somebody into a chemist, and he really did with that experiment. And I always think of that when I'm teaching now, that, you know, most students just sitting there going, whatever, you know, Hal's talking about something, okay, nobody cares. But there's one guy or one woman in the audience who's just transfixed, I hope, and is going to have that same reaction. So I think we got to really think about that. That we don't know when we're influencing people, but with our enthusiasm, with our excitement, and I am still, you know, in my late 50s now, still truly excited about chemistry. I wake up every morning and I mean it. I'm excited. It's another day, and quite frankly, I'm excited. It's another day that I can start thinking about chemistry, talking about chemistry, doing chemistry, whatever it may be. And in fact, quite honestly, I think it gets better. In terms of a later career faculty member, I have quite a lot of freedom to do what I want, and I don't have the same kind of pressures that younger faculty have on them, and indeed younger people before faculty positions. And so I have other pressures, but in terms of my scope of work, I can choose reasonably well what I want to do, and that's exciting. So we got to convey that. We've got to convey that. So where does that start? Well, it starts. It has to start early. And I'm now going to, because this was what Ryan was going to discuss, but I'll try my best to do it, because he is in an earlier stage of education than I am. He's working with high school students, and so I have to do this somewhat secondhand, but I'll try. I think first of all, getting chemistry into the curriculum early is important. Getting it into the curriculum, though, in a way that's interesting. And I think I look back on my experience, and again, I was fascinated by the subject, so it didn't really matter how it was taught, because it wasn't going to matter to me. I was still going to be interested, but I wasn't probably typical. I think that there were other people who had interest in science, but the way it was taught was not particularly interesting. It was taught from a perspective of, you know, you learn the periodic table and recite it, and don't worry about what it means. why it's important. Just remember, you know, hydrogen, helium, lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine. I can do it, at least for the first two rows. And just do that. And then remember that sodium ions have a single charge and calcium ions have two charges. But don't ever bother to put the periodic table together with that or anything like that. Just remember. And if you don't remember, you don't do well. And if you really do badly, you get kept behind for a few hours and, you know, and all the rest of it. And we start with that approach to science. And not surprisingly, people go, well, I'm not very interested in this. I don't want to do this. So got to find some good ways to encourage people to like science to start with. And Ryan said to me yesterday, it's not just, and I agree with him, it's not just a question of students who are really going to become chemists. Of course, we want to attract those students. We want to attract the people who are going to take this all the way and have a career in chemistry. But we also want to make science accessible to students who are not necessarily going to become scientists per se, but are going to become people of influence in different fields. And we want those people to appreciate science and understand science and understand how scientists think, because they, in their own indirect way, may be very important for the progression of science. So the way to do that is not just forced memory and punishment if you don't remember it and all the rest of it. The way to do it is to make science interesting from the start, without, again, and I want to make sure I don't go too far in the other direction, because I know that it's important to know the periodic table, and I don't dismiss the need to remember certain things, but I do think it's important that we make clear why you're remembering and link those activities to that memory requirement to something that is a bit more meaningful and more tangible. And I'll come back to that a little later when I talk about chemistry in higher education and chemistry in the context of other careers. So I think that in high school, that's the challenge. You get people interested, maintain their interest, whilst making it clear that, you know, this is not necessarily an easy academic choice. You're going to work hard. You're going to come up against people who are pretty tough academically, who demand a lot. And I think I'm one of those people. I think any student who's taken a class from me will say that. I demand it because I just think that's the way it should be. And you know, science is demanding. You need to understand. You need to know, and you need to be able to convey your ideas. So I don't want to push science too much in the direction of a field where, quote, anybody can succeed. I don't think that's very positive. There are people who should be doing other things. That's not a negative or a positive. It's just a fact, and they will be happier doing other subjects, and that's where they should be. And I think it's a very hard thing when, particularly at graduate level, students are not able to complete the PhD, for example, and they don't quite make it. That's very difficult. It's a very difficult decision in the context of faculty decision making. But the reality is that some people just are perhaps not, for whatever reason, it's not intellectual, it may be motivation, it may be a lot of reasons, not ready, at least at that point, to finish their PhD. So we have to let them go. And the same is perhaps true at undergraduate level as well. So we have to maintain standards, and that's important. But at the same time, we have to be encouraging. So I don't know if anybody's got any comments about any of that to start with. Okay, so then I think the next step is how do you encourage students to, if we've got them interested in high school and they are getting up to a good level and getting excited about science and about chemistry specifically. I've judged at quite a few high school fairs, California High School Fair each year, for quite a few years, and not just chemistry. This is science in general, and um, and these of course are the students who are really motivated, um, and um, and they're motivated enough to do research projects at high school and to actually present them. And I make it a point every year to go to at least one local high school fair and then the actual state science fair, the California State Science Fair, because I think this is almost a responsibility of senior scientists to do this. And it was interesting this year, because this year the California State Fair was online, and so presentations were made, same as normal posters, except it was online. But there wasn't the same kind of interaction. It was harder to have that interaction. So I could go and view the posters. I could leave comments. I could, I could do that sort of thing. But I couldn't interact with the students really in any meaningful way. And it became quite apparent quite quickly, I think, from the perspective of the organizers and everybody, that interaction, the interaction of the quote judges, the scientists who are judging the material with the students, was probably the most important thing in the entire fair. It's not the exact work that the students did. It's not the science they learned. It's not none of those things. It's meeting somebody who has taken what for the student at 17, 18 years of age is a very new area, something that they're perhaps still not so confident about. They're not sure, is this an area that they want to make their career in? They don't have, in general, access to senior scientists that, in their high school. They're not likely to meet people who've made a career out of science, and suddenly there they have someone in front of them who's talking to them and appreciating, first of all, what they've done and talking about what they've done. And then at least I try very hard to talk to them at an appropriate level, but push them so it's clear that they can go further, that the research they've done can go further. But it's interesting what they've done, it's exciting what they've done, and it's very impressive what they've done. And it always is, I assure you, the level of science presented at those kind of fairs is wonderful. And that interaction, I think, is so important for a student to think, well, okay, it is possible to take this science, take what I'm interested in, and I can make a career out of it. And I'm talking to them as an academic scientist, but the judges at these fairs is much broader than that. There are many industrial people there from all sorts of fields, from the energy field to the medical field and so on and so forth, and right across the board. And so that exposure, I think, can be very important. We also do the same sort of thing in USC. We have summer programs for high school students who are just about to graduate. Maybe they've got one more year left in high school, or they have just graduated. Usually one more year left, and we try to bring them in and expose them to the university atmosphere. And I think this is the earlier panel on women in science, and I would just broaden that to just general diversity in science. One thing that I think is very important is, and this applies to anybody, is to start to feel comfortable in the university environment and realize that you can be part of this. And I've seen many students from what will be described as minority backgrounds, who are excellent students, excellent intellectually, but their comfort level in a major university, and at least initially, is low, and that can actually have a very negative effect on their progression. They don't feel like they belong, and it's something that they will in time get over, but that problem initially can have a really quite negative impact on, and even in the worst possible scenario, could cause them to leave. And so I think I absolutely believe in our department and our school that we make everybody equally welcome, and we work hard to do that. But you know, it is a reality that can become a problem, and so introducing younger students, high school students, to the environment as an early stage. I had a wonderful student. He's now I won't mention his name, but he's now an undergraduate at a let's say a leading University of California campus. He worked with me for a couple of years. He's a great guy, and he was I think he was 16 when he started in our lab, and at the time we had a few master's students and PhD students, of course, a little older, and they kind of took him under his wing, and under their wing, and he learned so much from them. He learned some chemistry. He learned a lot of other stuff, probably some stuff I don't know about that they told him about. But he learned life skills. He learned everything. He just became so comfortable in the lab, and he's now, I think, very comfortable in his current undergraduate setting as well. And that I think was a wonderful example of somebody growing not just as a scientist but as an individual. And he's now doing he's well, I don't want to identify him, but he is doing chemistry, and he's following a career path that I think is going to be terrific, and he will be very successful. So and that came from this early exposure to how a lab works, and came from him, I think, becoming comfortable in the lab, comfortable talking to me as the PI of the lab, comfortable interacting with the PhD and master students, and of course learning about the science as well. So that was a great example, but I could tell you many more of those as well. So that's what we got to do at age 17, 18. As students become undergraduates, you know, I think they become exposed to many more opportunities of all sorts, academic and otherwise, within the university system. And we're going to lose some people, you know, for various reasons. And I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. That people may come in with science and chemistry goals, but then they discover that they really would prefer to study something else. And I think that's terrific if they want to do that and they find something else that's better, they should do it. There's no question. So I don't think we should be trying to force that issue too much. But again, we we need to do very similar things at the undergraduate level. I won't go too much into my thoughts on some undergraduate education, but a lot of it is again very memory based and not, I think, appealing to the students. It's not necessary to do it that way. Ken, when he introduced me, said I've done a lot of work on problem-based learning in education, and I really believe in that. And it's essentially giving students problems to solve, problems that are based on an area of instruction. It's not just throwing them out there and telling them to do anything. It's formal, but it requires application of information provided through lectures initially, but application of information to show why it matters, why it matters to know. And I gave a talk earlier on this week, and we talked about things like log P and pKa and very basic physical chemical properties, and you know, they can be memorized, but it's pretty meaningless to memorize it. But why, in my context, why does it matter for the delivery of a drug? And how is a change in log P or a change in pKa going to affect the ability to deliver a drug orally? This is the sort of thing that can be used, and many other things, to illustrate the importance of what on the face of it are rather dull physicochemical properties. And I personally don't think they're dull, but I think most people, certainly most undergrad students, might think they're dull. And so I think that's very important. We have a growing a BS program in pharmacology at USC, and one of the things that we're trying to do there is attract students who have an interest in chemistry, but you know, have not quite decided what field they want to go into, or even if they want to really pursue chemistry, but we hope to show them through applications of chemistry that they're really, that first of all, there are careers out there for them, and secondly, that their interest in chemistry is not misplaced. In fact, we want to promote their interest and create more interest. So it's a challenge because there's lots of other fields trying to do the same thing, and that's okay. I think we can challenge other fields. I think we can we most definitely have the raw material to do it in terms of the potential of chemistry. I do think sometimes we are. I notice amongst my faculty colleagues at USC, I don't think the chemists and the scientists in general are upfront enough in terms of pushing their subjects, and I think we need to do that more. We need to show how exciting chemistry is, and we need to, with our own personalities, hopefully make that clear as well as through the material itself. I think other fields perhaps do that a little better. So that's a challenge. And then so moving beyond the undergraduate to graduate level, to master's, to PhD, and in my case to PharmD, then the goal. I see Ryan. Ryan, hello.
Yeah, Ryan. Good to see you.
I had it at 1 o'clock. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, that's all right. So I'm going to let me very quickly. I've been talking basically for 40 minutes here, and I've kind of gone through the ideas that we discussed. I started off with a little personal discussion. I was going to come back to that. I also, and I've gone through the stages of education. I talked as best I could about high school, but I'm sure you've got more to say about that. And I just talked through undergraduate. We were just going to move to graduate programs, but why don't we take a step back and you can say a little bit about yourself first of all, and then maybe go back to the high school
Yeah.
issues.
Yeah, it's Dr. Howard. Actually, if this panel is for YP is more young professional. So, and you already covered the high school, K-12, and college. But professional mostly mean people already in the professional track, but an early career. Maybe we can more because we already covered the high school, college. Well, Ryan can say a little bit more on that, but it's kind of it's linked. So it's high school can be related, but it's how do you give advice them? How do they lead to successful young professional? Okay, so let me explain because for us, we actually have committee on STEM K-12. We have committee on college students. We also have committee specific on YP. So young professional mostly means after college and under 35 years old, early career. So I understand, it's also important, for the high school education, but maybe you can chat a bit about how to lead, high school student, college student into successful young professional, and the young professionals, how do they get the resources to overcome the difficulties? And for example, the lab schools, they are not covered by the professor anymore, and their new job, they are new, and it's no longer it's like a course project. It made like a real life things, and they also have life, career, their own personal life. So how do they cope with this? So maybe we can kind of gear a little more on the YP, but it's also related to high school and college as well. Yeah. So sorry for mentioning this. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I guess I could talk a little bit about that. So I got a PhD in postdoc, and then actually worked in industry for a bit before going to education. But I think I don't know. I did find that being a young professional in chemistry was pretty challenging. There weren't as many resources. I also graduated maybe 2010 for my PhD, and then postdoc was like 2012. So the job market was maybe a little tough. But I think that a lot of it comes down to maybe resiliency of the person, but also I think a flexibility in terms of understanding what options are out there and what jobs are rewarding and exciting. And I think for me, it was, I was pretty narrow in my focus. It was either I'm going to be in an academic, which is what I kind of wanted to do originally, or I was going to be in industry and or maybe government. But that kind of was, I think, a bit of a narrow focus. I feel like right now, especially, we're seeing this with the pandemic and such, is the value, I think, of science literacy. I think that there are a variety of really exciting careers that one can have, let's say, in science writing, in science communication. I mean, we see how valuable that is right now, especially with the virology becoming such like a central topic, that these people who can write about virology and clearly communicate information is so important. And with the amount of sort of disinformation, let's say, about the pandemic we see kind of like how important those people can be towards interpreting those. Famously, the Yang document that came out, right, was a huge deal that really took scientists to debunk and to sort of show why this may not be relevant. So I think having like the flexibility and understanding of the different possible tracks that one can be in, being open to different ideas and different options, at least to try jobs for a period of time, can be rewarding. But it is a bit tough, I think. With the PhD and such, I was in more of an organic field in chemical biology, and I found that the options in industry were a little bit limited in terms of what you can do. There weren't as many jobs as I thought there would be, maybe in industry. A lot of people kind of come at academia thinking that, well, if academics don't work out, I'll just get a job in industry, and it's not that easy. So I think relying on what maybe the ACS can provide and other national organizations, trying to find mentors, people who can help you sort of find guidance is really important, but also being really open to other opportunities. Like I love teaching high school. I think it's exciting. It's different. Like every day is dynamic. A lot of the same things that I think about are a lot of the same questions I had about being a scientist. I apply the same sort of thinking and same sort of ideas towards my approach towards education and how I teach students and how I teach and inspire young people. And I think, you still have like that same principles that you learn and the same ideas that you learned about as a PhD or as even an undergrad, and applying that to these situations. It's a lot of fun, and it's interesting. It's a very exciting field. So I think that like being open to those opportunities is really helpful because, it's not maybe as many like obvious chemistry jobs out there as it may seem.
Yeah, and I think that one thing, if I could just contrast this with, so I got my PhD in 1990, and it's a long time ago, and it seems even longer ago in terms of the way things have changed. There was a pretty clear route for me, and I followed it, and it worked. And that was not true of everybody, but it was somewhat more true. I think, and I tell PhD students, current PhD students, that it's not going to be as clear when you graduate. I think you have to make things happen. I have one of my PhD students who graduated in 2010 or so. He actually only just got his first full-time job. Now he's worked and he's actually very entrepreneurial, and he's set up businesses and he's done many other things. So he's been doing fine, but he actually finally did, and this is very recently, got a full-time job. And that's partly through his choice, but I think he understood that going out, and so it wasn't such a problem for him because he understood that was probably going to be the situation. I think the shock comes perhaps with people who don't prepare themselves for that, and then suddenly there's nothing there. And what I was saying earlier, I think, is you use the term resiliency, and I actually think that's an important term. And I was trying earlier to balance the idea that on the one hand, yes, we want to encourage people. On the other hand, we've really still got to be very serious about not having people come through the system who really can't make it. We've got to be careful, and that's the resiliency part that we have to build into students, that when they graduate, they can deal with it with a little bit of failure, and they can change their goals, perhaps, like you said you did, and still inherently have that love of chemistry, which underpins everything. Because if that's there, then it'll work out. It may not work out quite how you thought it would, but it'll work out. And I think that's maybe a message we need to send. But things have changed in that respect. I think it is a little more difficult now. And I think the other thing people need to be thinking about, perhaps from an earlier stage, is how they're going to use their chemistry, and in general, the profession needs to be thinking about where can chemists work. What are the options? It doesn't just have to be a university or industry, right? There's lots of other possibilities. That chemistry training and the logic of chemistry training, the logic that it gives you, you can apply in a lot of areas. So yeah, I think it's pretty challenging. I do. I really do. And I'm in a situation at USC where I work on the one hand with PhD students and master's students who are committed to science and are doing science degrees. On the other hand, I'm working with PharmD students who also have a very good science background, but they are more oriented to clinical work. But there's definitely sort of a middle ground where you can be doing pretty good science, but also doing some clinical work. And I have to say that in some cases, it makes more sense to do the chemistry with the clinical background. I think the opportunities for those students might be greater, and this is partly they still have the chemistry, but they then have this other string to their bow, and I don't know exactly how to say this in quickly, but I think that what that suggests to me is that PhDs, whilst we can't lose the sort of inherent flavor of the PhD that it's got to be hardcore science and you've got to learn how to do science, but can we also get other skills into the PhD that will help? And that's a difficult problem, I think, because you don't want to lose the fundamental PhD training, which is, get in the lab and figure things out and work hard and learn scientific process and so on and so forth. So that can't be replaced, but can you add things that would help people after they graduate? Other kinds of skills. What skills did you think you needed that you perhaps didn't know?
Well, I mean, I think writing and communication skills are really important to have. If you can't clearly communicate your scientific concepts to people, then that's going to be very tough to get jobs and such. But yeah, I mean, I think incorporating some other, like you said, other skills, other things that you can have into the doctoral program could be helpful, depending on what they want to do, right? So I think that having a series of options, a series of classes or trainings or modules or whatever for students to take in addition to that could be useful, maybe even earlier on, right? It'd be kind of the beginning of that, before they get out of their sort of coursework, could be helpful, just because then they can kind of have a path or a decision maybe in terms of what they want to do a little bit earlier on. I think in the postdoctoral training, that would be helpful too, because they're really starting to gain independence towards what sort of jobs they want to be in or what sort of careers they want to be in. That could be something that would be useful. I think it's like I was at NYU Medical School for my postdoc, and it was a very heavy postdoc lab and heavy postdoc community. And so that was kind of nice having a lot of other postdocs there to talk to and figure out what they were thinking about and planning on doing, what they're planning on doing next. But at the same time, I mean, as a postdoc, you're very independent in terms of what you're doing, and you have your own goals, and you have a lot of people are later in life, they have families, they have other things. So having like the camaraderie is nice, but maybe having some sort of mentoring or formal mentoring for those postdocs would have been really useful, especially when you have a large community like that in a facility that's kind of geared towards that. But yeah, I mean, I was in a pretty good lab and we published a lot of papers in Nature Science Cell, but people would take 6, 7, 8, 9 years to get an academic position when they were done. And, for me, that wasn't really in the cards for what I wanted to do. So then, moving to industry made more sense. But I don't know how to fix that sort of field. I mean, again, like a lot of people are waiting to get into academics. Maybe expanding government research should be an option. But yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of this, and I remember kind of vividly politicians at the time sort of saying, well, we need more STEM people. We need more STEM people to do science, and we need to raise more science and engineering students. And I remember hearing people calling in and saying, well, like, I've been a postdoc for 8 years, you know, like what,
You can't
what
get
are we
a job
talking
with it.
about, right? Yeah, like, I mean, there's this call towards like more and more and more scientists. I mean, we need very specific skills, right? I think we need more physicists. I think, you know, and mathematicians maybe, but like, it's hard because I think that like, yeah, like you're saying, like you have to be very resilient, you have to be determined, you have to have maybe be creative about what you're thinking of doing. But otherwise it's a long path. I mean, it doesn't mean it's not a great path for certain people and the right personality types, the people who really want to do certain types of research, but you have to be willing to go through a lot of time and channels. Now I was in at that point, I was in a more molecular biology type lab. So the postdocs are longer. I think chemistry, maybe you're probably in the 2 to 3 year time period for most labs. Yeah. But there it was, yeah, that's just kind of maybe was more the for that field. But still, it's like you said, it's not a direct path as it may have been before. So
do you think there should be different kinds of postdocs? You know, in other words, the pretty much right now, there's only one kind of postdoc, right? Which is get in the lab for a long time every day, work hard, you know, and produce papers. And that leads for the people who are successful, and it's getting harder and harder. But the people who are successful, they do end up with an academic position. But the percentage, I don't know what they are, but the percentage of people who come out within, you know, certainly within a few years, 3 or 4 years, and get an academic position is not high. And so I wonder if there really ought to be different kinds of postdocs, which are not funded, maybe not NIH, NSF funded, but more structured to career, you know. So it still would involve a lot of science research, but it wouldn't quite be as important to knock out, you know, 3 Nature papers before you can move on. As long as you have some productivity, you learn other skills, deliberately learn other skills, which direct you to either it could still be to an academic career, but it might not be to the sort of quite as high level quote career, but it'd still be a very valuable academic career, or an industrial or some other government career. You think that would work?
Yeah, I mean, like, so I had at Michigan, there was like some people took like a year, I guess it was a paid year for teaching, right? Where they would teach for like, not just being a TA, but like actually working with someone who's in science education for a year in their lab and to teach a class with them and co-teach and learn more about instruction, how to kind of be a science instructor. And so that was a really interesting program. I thought was helpful for people maybe who are interested in that in the field of chemical education. I think there's also kind of like a little bit of a, like you said, higher level, like there's still this like kind of hierarchy or tier of like where people like of what value is what, right? Like if working at a community college may not be seen the same as working at a liberal arts college or working at an R01. So, you know, I think that kind of needs to change a little bit too, right? Because I mean, like I remember my advisor saying when she was at Michigan, she was just like, I could never do research at a small institution. It just would be too hard to just do only undergrad research. So those people are talented to come up with ideas that work with just an undergrad only lab. Like it's not easy to design scientific projects like that if they get published. So like that's a really valuable skill set. And like, how do you identify that? How do you develop that as a grad student? Like maybe there needs to be something where they do more work with undergrads, right? Where there's some more, you know, like they're running a little undergrad research group within a, you know, chemistry position. But it's hard when you're a PI, when you need to publish. And so having someone your postdoc spend this time, you know, messing around with undergrads to try to develop their own projects isn't valuable for you who are paying them, right? So then there has to be some other external way of doing that. But those things would be really valuable to identify, like who's going to be really good at Amherst, right? Like those people come from really good labs and have great science backgrounds and are really valuable science educators in terms of developing who's going to go to grad school next too. I think a liberal arts education often does turn out very good grad students.
Yeah, I agree. No, I think you're right, and I think this is a big weakness in the system. It's just a one size fits all. And from the PI perspective, it can only be that way because you've got money from NIH or wherever, and you got to spend it and produce. And if you don't, you're not going to get any more money. So, so what can you do? All you can do is put your postdocs in the lab and get them working. But that's really not, well, it might be broadly scientifically beneficial, in terms of actually of good science, but it's certainly not beneficial to those individuals who are the postdocs by and large. I think that's an important point. And I think it is, by the way, beginning to happen, but it's a struggle in terms of getting the funding for it, because who's going to fund it? And the answer is not very many people. Maybe one or two enlightened people would, but it's not easy to get funding to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, I wonder about like moving into other private funding sources besides just governmental, right? I mean, you'd love to see the government taking care of a lot of things like that. But I always wonder, like, if we could reach out to more entrepreneurs and sell the value of something like this and say how important it is to train good high school teachers, train good, community college teachers, train good lecturers, and how that would work with Tesla or someone funding something, right? Like there's just so much money out there in these large organizations, and so many people with like so much. I wonder, like, the Gates Foundation does their stuff, but you wonder if there's just other sources there, because like you said, like government has a limited budget. It's very difficult to get government funding. It's getting harder to get government funding, right, than it was 20 years ago. And it changes based on elections and stuff, right? Which maybe isn't totally fair, I think, to science. So it would be great to have other sources. And I don't know, again, like you said, you need a fair amount of money for it. But I think now, like I look at something like community college teaching, I mean, it's a great job. It's a government job. And, you get your summers off if you want them. And so I think that I looked down on that sort of job when I was going through a PhD and thinking about being an academic, right? Like, it's like, I want to be an R01. I don't want to do small school teaching. I don't want to teach at community college. But now I have friends who did teach at community college, and they're having a great time, and doing other things they want to do, and educating young people and going to conferences and publishing research on education. And they're loving what they're doing. And, I think it's like you look at that as like failing or something when you're a grad student. And I think that's
the problem, right?
A problem.
Because that's you're exactly right. That is looked upon as failing.
Right.
And it because where succeeding is getting a faculty position in a major university broadly, right? And that's the problem. Neither of those are failing, and they're both succeeding. They're succeeding at doing different things, and that's, I think, where maybe, I'm probably I hope I'm not completely to blame, but I'm certainly part of a system that does things like that. There's no question about it. One Nature paper, you're great, but a couple of papers in smaller journals and some ability to teach, well, that's failing, and that's clearly not true.
Right.
So I don't know whether this helps people who are in this situation at the moment, but I think this kind of discussion just needs to be had, and so that we can start to convince those with money, whether it be external foundations or within the university. I think to be fair, USC has some recognition of this. There are some teaching postdocs available, but I don't think, even though that's true, I don't think the if you ask most people, they would still subscribe to the, Nature paper good, teaching postdoc not good theory. I don't think there's that many people who would view those as being equivalent and equally valid and valuable, and so on.
Yeah, I would say even to that point too, with just like the publication records. I mean, I know, again, like the lab I was in, we published in those journals, and like if you were 4 or 5 months late with essentially the same study, you were publishing in a journal that was, not Nature, right? Even though you had essentially the same research, same results, if they got there first, now you're in another journal. So then when you're sending out your applications and you've got a JBC paper instead of a Nature paper, then they're like, oh, well, he doesn't know as much as the other person. It's like, well, they were doing the same project. It's just that group got there before us by 6 months, right? And so therefore, now you're not as good as the other person. So even that publication record, I think it goes down to like HR, right? Like, I think a lot of times as scientists, we're battling kind of hiring in this sort of stigma like you're talking about. And that makes it difficult when you're trying to get jobs and such, because it does come down often to these sort of chance, I would say, that you have opposed to the maybe quality of the research and things. So I think we need to do a better job of hiring, really, of having people maybe with science backgrounds doing some of the hiring, right? Like that would be really helpful at some of these companies like pharma companies and biotech companies. I don't think they really have that. There should be people who are maybe, and that would be a field that someone could go into with a science background.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that would be so like a really good sell to a company like that to say, yeah, like I can read through this person's publication, understand what they're doing, and understand that this is really relevant to what we're trying to do as a company. So we should interview this person. That would be super helpful too.
Yeah, and you think that's not really happening sufficiently, at least at the initial stage of hiring, that the HR are just.
Yeah, I don't think it does. I think because it's the scientists don't. I mean, at least for the companies that I was at, the scientists don't see the applications until they've been filtered through HR. So they don't get to go in and look at each one. And even if you did, you get 200 people apply. You're someone who's working in industry, like you've got your 9 to 5 sort of stuff you've got to be doing, the meetings you got to go to, and that, and so like I think that's another thing I found too in industry that was interesting is like, it's almost this Peter principle, right? You get promoted into the point where you can't do your job, and so like you're a really good bench scientist and you do really well on the bench, and so then they make you a principal scientist, but like you may not be someone who's likes to have meetings all the time and have meetings with people and make these large decisions but never get your hands wet. Like I remember a couple of people who just like wanted to not have anyone under them. They want to do the science because that's what they're really interested in, and they're really good at it. And it was sort of like, yes, I want more money, but I don't want to have people be supporters because I'm good at science. I think that's another thing that some companies kind of didn't look at it. So therefore also like the skills of being a managerial scientist, like you're saying before, is something that can be developed maybe in the graduate training a little bit more to say, yeah, this person has the ability to run a small group within a company and manage people really well. So
it comes back to this issue of how do you train people and what their goal is, because I agree that some people are just great on the bench and that's where they should be, and it shouldn't be a question of money. Their skills should be recognized. They should be able to be promoted without changing their job because they're really valuable. On the other hand, other people definitely do have the skill set to run a group, and both the personal skill set and also the ability to understand the data and so on and so. And I think that's a different track. And I don't know how early you can identify somebody who's going to be good one way or the other, but probably you can. I think that there are certain characteristics, certain personal characteristics of people that maybe tell them personally at an early stage, I'm going to be a good bench scientist, but that's what I want to do, or I'm going to be somebody who would, maybe I'm not such a good bench scientist, but I get on well with people. I can motivate people to do that work, and I enjoy looking at the data. I don't perhaps enjoy the process of collecting it quite as much. And again, when you put that, I don't know when you make that decision, but you can value both. So I'm looking at the chat here. Sorry, Ken, we're just rambling on here now. So, we would like to hear from. Sorry, everybody who's waiting to come on. Tyrone,